Hi, my three biggest passions in life are coffee, One Piece, and Magic: The Gathering. And today, I'm gonna be uniting all three of these things into a video that I have wanted to make for a long time. Because in the short 2 years that this card game has just completely taken over my life and also my wallet, I've always wished to be able to play some type of anime deck. And even though there are of course both anime style cards, some of them with truly stunning art, and also the so-called Universe Beyond series, with franchises like Lord of the Rings, Assassin's Creed, or even SpongeBob, what have been turned into Magic cards, so far there hasn't been a single anime that has been turned properly into a set of Magic cards. But today, we're gonna finally be changing that, because I'm gonna be starting to build my very own exclusive Magic set that I'm gonna call Anime Legends, and we'll start by turning one of my all-time favorite characters into custom Magic: The Gathering cards, my favorite bouncy rubber boy, Monkey D. Luffy. I've been wanting to do this for like forever, gosh, okay. Now for those of you who don't really play Magic, I'll be explaining as much as I can here about my own reasoning for card design. And for those of you watching who are Magic experts, please, I know I'm probably far from being good enough to actually design a real Magic card that's properly balanced and all, so forgive me if I do get some of these a little bit wrong and some of them are a little bit too broken. Alright, but with that being said, let me introduce you to Monkey D. Luffy Rubberman. This is a legendary creature because, I mean, there's only one Luffy, and it would be kind of weird to suddenly have two Luffys, right? With the subtypes human and pirates. Now, what I think is nice is that both of these are actually fairly relevant creature types in Magic, with pirate being a super cool tribal option, especially in Commander, Magic's most popular 4-player format, and humans are just so strong, they're even viable, sometimes at least, in more competitive formats like Modern. Now, most importantly, we have to look at Luffy's casting cost, of course. In Magic, there are 5 different types of mana, each with their own meaning, lore, and specialities. And it honestly was always a given for me that Luffy would be a Boros card, meaning that you would need both red and white mana in order to cast it. Not only does this specific color combination work really nicely with Luffy's general color schemes, his yellow straw hat and his red shirt, but it also makes a lot of sense character-wise, I think. If you watch One Piece, you'll know that Luffy is as good a guy as it gets, helping people in need, fighting evil forces, and wanting freedom and peace for his friends. So a true hero, in other words, which in Magic: The Gathering, if you know anything about it, is as white, I think, as it gets. Now, at the same time, Luffy's of course also insanely impulsive, storms into any fight, punches really hard, and just overall has a really wild and kind of untamable nature. Oh, and he can even create fire. In other words, red just felt by far like the most natural second color choice for him. Now, since Luffy has some quite strong abilities, I also decided to increase his casting cost to 3 mana. That last one can be paid by any mana, as Luffy has a lot of versatility, and depending on the situation, could also be summoned with other colors, I think. Next, of course, pulling Luffy, one of the most popular and most powerful anime protagonists out there, should be a really rare thing, so this card is actually ironically not rare but a mythic, meaning that it appears even less than a regular rare card in Magic.
Oh my god!
And that rarity and power actually also shows in his base stats. For 3 mana, you get a Luffy with 3 power and 4 toughness, which any Magic player would tell you is a pretty decent deal all by itself. After all, not only does Luffy punch incredibly hard, being able to level a neighborhood pretty easily, even in his base form, he has his iconic rubber body, which makes him pretty much immune to a ton of different attacks, ranging from bullets to punches to electricity, which is of course why I just had to give him 4 toughness. After all, as we saw in his fight against Enel, Luffy quite literally can tank a powerful lightning bolt, one of Magic's most iconic cards that deals 3 damage. But now I do want to get to the juicy bit. Luffy's abilities, which is where I just had way too much fun, I gotta say, and might have gone a little bit overboard, which in the One Piece world is of course also not really a good thing. So when you cast Luffy, Luffy enters the battlefield with the keywords Haste and Reach. Haste means that a creature can attack immediately, while other creatures usually need to wait a turn. And my reasoning for this is that Luffy, of course, is one of the fastest characters in the story, fighting against the light devil fruit user Kizaru and a ton of other really speedy characters, and really having no issues outpacing them at all. Reach, meanwhile, means that Luffy can block creatures with flying, which he absolutely should, because after all, he can stretch and shoot out his arms for crazy distances, simply pulling any flyer down from the sky or just jumping up really high himself. Next up, let's look at this line here, because being one of the most notorious pirate captains in One Piece and one of the 4 Emperors of the Sea, Luffy of course inspires all of his allies and gives them faith and morale to go beyond their own limits and keep fighting for him. As a result, I thought it would be, some nice flavor to have Luffy buff any other pirate that you control by giving them +2 power and then +1 toughness. Like a true pirate captain. Now this of course would hopefully inspire people to build a pirate-themed deck with Luffy as the commander, or at least as a centerpiece of that deck. And I'm actually gonna be turning up the dial on that synergy level even more with his last, and in my opinion, by far most fun ability as well, because whenever you have Luffy attack another player, you can put a special counter on it. A gear counter that I of course took inspiration from Luffy's own power system, where he gets increasingly more powerful in his gear 2nd, gear 3rd, and gear 4th forms. Now on top of that, if you don't want to wait for several rounds to get this effect, you can put an additional gear counter on Luffy for each other attacking pirate you control as well, which I think also nicely encourages players to set up the field with some other popular pirate creatures that are smaller, like Ragavan, to swing in together with Luffy at the same time. Now, why do we care about Luffy getting these gear counters? And I gotta say, I'm kind of proud of this one a little bit. Once Luffy has 5 or more gear counters on him, that can just mean one single thing. Luffy is now in his godly form, gear 5th. That means that during your attack step, once you put that 5th gear counter on Luffy, you now may choose to exile him, unless you want to keep having him attacking, I guess. I kinda wanted to leave that option up to the players in case they have lethal at that point or something. But if you choose to exile him, he will then return to the battlefield transformed, a mechanic that I really enjoyed from the Modern Horizon 3 set with cards like a Johnny here. Now, into what does Luffy transform, you ask? Come on, you know what's coming. When you hear those drums of liberation, let me introduce you to the backside of Luffy, the legendary planeswalker, Sun God Nika. Now, in case you don't know, planeswalkers in Magic are a very unique card type. Basically, they're characters that can travel between the different planes of the Magic multiverse and then cast spells using their loyalty counter, so basically a little bit like their own little player. Which also means that they can be attacked by your opponent just like you can. Now, Gear 5 Luffy here, of course, comes into play with 5 loyalty counters, since he's now in Gear 5, which I thought was again also a nice little callback to the gear counters from the front of the card as well. Because we do know that flavor is really important. That means that Luffy has basically 5 points now to spend on his various abilities, and if his counter reaches 0, he vanishes, or I guess dies. And as most planeswalkers do, Gear 5 Luffy has 3 abilities that you can now activate during your second main phase after you've just transformed him during combat. And I gotta say, all 3 of them are quite powerful and maybe a little bit too broken, I will admit, but at the same time, it's not really that easy to flip Luffy to begin with without him getting removed, and unless you have like 4 other pirates on board already, you will need at least multiple rounds of attack without him dying to even have a chance of flipping him. Now, with that being said, let's get to his first ability. This first ability adds +2 loyalty counters for him. With this ability, he can return a target permanent to its owner's hand, and this of course is once again a reference to Luffy's rubber powers, which I just really wanted to include since returning a card to a player's hand is called bouncing something amongst Magic players, so it's a good way to either get rid of a strong creature that your opponent controls, or alternatively, bounce one of your own creatures. For example, if it has a ETB effect, which stands for enters the battlefield, to make use of its special ability once again. Again, I like to think very much like Luffy himself, who can use his powers to both fight enemies, but also help his own friends. Now, after thinking about it a little bit, I actually did choose permanent here over just creature, because while at first I was kind of thinking that Luffy would only be able to bounce back creatures that he was fighting, in his Gear 5th form, Luffy can actually turn the literal world and ground around him into rubber, and therefore I think it's only fair that he could bounce everything from creatures to lands to artifacts, because in this form, nothing is safe. And yes, I am completely aware that this is very broken, especially for a plus ability, but again, this is a god that won't be coming down sooner than like turn 5 or 6 usually. Oh, and actually just realized that bouncing back to hand makes also sense since Luffy punches with his giant rubber fist, so that worked out surprisingly nicely. But let's now look at his second ability. For -1, so paying 1 loyalty counter, until your next turn, you, the player, and one target permanent card, like a creature or artifact, will have protection from everything, and you get to create a treasure token as well. Now this is actually a quite rare effect in Magic the Gathering overall, with the most famous cards doing this being probably the One Ring and Teferi's Protection. But to me, it kind of felt like a really nice fitting neutral ability, because being in his god form now, Luffy's pretty close to invulnerable, especially with his advanced armament and Conqueror's Haki coating. Oh, and did I mention that Luffy has also advanced Future Sight? That means that he can now keep up with pretty much any threat when it comes to speed, power, and endurance, easily predicting the other player's move. And so I thought that giving Nika Luffy, who is also known as the Protector of Slaves, a protection ability was gonna be a given, right? And that way you can now protect yourself from damage or any other effects targeting you as a player, but you will notice that Luffy can also, if he wants to, target himself with that ability, giving him the ability to protect himself for as long as necessary after he sticks around. Now, of course, I think it does make sense that you can just do this infinitely often, since Luffy does tend to run out of gas in his Gear 5th form the more that he needs to use it, and that's why I decided in the end to have this ability cost -1. Plus, with the 1 treasure token I threw in, which is of course Giga on brand for One Piece, a story about finding, you know, that one big treasure, you also turn your loyalty counter into a resource that you can use for something else later on. But, of course, the most exciting ability of any Planeswalker, at least for me, is usually their ultimate. This is the most bottom ability that usually costs a lot of loyalty and often can either kill the Planeswalker or just straight up end the game, and often does both. In Luffy's case, Gear 5 Nika's ultimate move is of course something absolutely crazy destructive. In the story, we've now seen Luffy blow up his fist to the size of an entire island and thus defeating one of the strongest creatures in all of One Piece, Kaido. But not only that, Luffy can manipulate matter, like grabbing lightning out of the sky, using fire, or really any type of goofy but also really scary move that he can imagine. And that's why to me felt right that Luffy's ultimate Gear 5 move deals 5 damage to each of up to 5 targets, and if you're a commander player, you might know the card that inspired this, Crackle with Power. Which again, super fitting I think, because this card might as well be reprinted as Gear 5 Luffy. It's red, like Luffy's front, and as we just said as well, he literally does crackle with power in this form, including his Conqueror's Haki Lightning going crazy and blasting in all directions. Of course, the 5 damage and 5 targets are also an homage to his Gear 5, but also it just makes sense to me that in an all-out attack, Sun God Luffy could deal some absolutely crazy damage to a bunch of enemies at the same time. Or I guess alternatively, you could also interpret this as a Conqueror's Haki Blast, taking out any creature that's too weak for his crazy Conqueror spirits. Again, I kind of love how in the end, even accidentally, some of these just work in different layers. But now, just how Luffy usually doesn't just throw everything into one big attack right after transforming into Gear 5, Planeswalker Luffy here also needs to at least use his +2 bounce ability once to be able to use this final move, which luckily also helps you get rid of one potential threat to Luffy himself. But then you can also be tactical with it and stall for time with his -1 ability as well. Now, one other side effect, and even maybe a slight drawback that I just realized, but that also makes surprisingly a lot of sense thematically, is that once Luffy transforms into Gear 5, other pirates that attacked with him will actually end up losing the +2/+1 bonus, and thus might actually die if you didn't take that sudden nerf into account yourself. Something that I think is reflected nicely by how Luffy's transformation is such a force of nature that even his own allies need to be careful to not be caught in it. Now at this point, I gotta come clean and say that I originally actually came up with 8 different anime characters turned into magic cards for this video, but I didn't expect to nerd out so hard on one of them that I'd be talking for like almost 20 minutes now at this point. So instead of turning this into like a 2-hour video, I will save the others like Madara or Rimuru for another video, so let me know if you want to see that. But instead, I will give you guys a little bonus card that I came up with for Luffy and the One Piece theme in particular. Let me introduce you to the uncommon legendary artifact, the Straw Hat. Yes, I went there. Okay, to give you guys a little bit of context here, I personally absolutely love playing Hammer Time, a modern deck that's just full of weird and powerful and quirky equipments like this, like the Colossus Hammer, and so I saw the chance here and I gotta admit, and I just took it. The Straw Hat is of course legendary because, well, there is of course only one, unless you count the giant one up in Marijoa, but it is only an uncommon because this card is very heavily restricted by its use in a pirate-themed deck. Now, you might notice that this card doesn't even have a casting cost. And that's because I decided to do something really weird and instead go with the suspend mechanic. That means that for 1 white mana, because it's a Straw Hat, and I mean guys, only good guys wear the Straw Hat, this card will be exiled with 3 time counters on it. Then, at the beginning of your turn, you can remove a time counter from it, and once it has no counters left, you can cast it for free. Now, the idea behind this is that I really wanted to somehow include the concept of inherited will into this card as well. The Straw Hat, in case you don't know, came down from Joy Boy over probably many other people, down to Gold Roger, down to Shanks, who then gave it to Luffy. Therefore, 3 time counters for the 3 big generations of owners before Luffy. And its abilities, of course, also homage to exactly that. Now, we don't quite know yet what actually makes the Straw Hat so special, but I have no doubt at all that there is going to be some real power hidden in it. And of course, its wearer also carries on the will of those before him. And therefore, the ability that I choose for it is that the equipped creature gets +2 power and +1 toughness for each creature card in your graveyard, and also trample, symbolizing the people who wore it in past eras and their strength and will imbued in it now as well. Now, I'm completely aware that this can of course get quite crazy quite quickly if you play a creature heavy deck, so to restrict it a little bit, I gave it a quite high equip cost of 4 mana. However, as you can tell, I did stick with the One Piece theme here and also allow the player to spend just 1 red mana to equip the Straw Hat to any target pirate you control. After all, this has only been worn by pirates, it's Luffy's hat, and he should be able to wear it fairly easily, and I'm at least telling myself that it's not too broken since you're required to play both red and white mana in order to make use of this artifact properly. Though of course it also kind of screams, play this in a Luffy deck. It's still gonna be pretty useful if you just equip it to any other pirate should Luffy die or just not be available, just how I'm pretty sure that Luffy himself would pass on the Straw Hat in the story if he had to, just like Roger did, for example. Okay, but now I'm just insanely curious. What do you think? Would you play these cards? Did I do an okay job power and flavor-wise, you think? Or did I just let my inner fanboy get way too crazy with my first ever card designs here? I'm really excited to read your comments. Otherwise, thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this and want to see more, let me know. And yeah,